Good morning, Anahi.
Good morning, Dan.
What are we chatting about this week?
So today we're going a little spicy. So we're going to talk about how different cultures perceive wealth planning, why clients don't take action, and breaking up with your old advisor.
Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it. Okay, we're just going kind of throwing elbows in every direction here.
Yes.
Okay.
For the first topic I wanted to talk about, it's something that doesn't get talked about often or something that I don't often hear a lot being talked about, and that's just how different cultures perceive wealth planning. So I know that different cultures view money or talk about money very differently. So two people can be making the exact same amount, have the about the same assets, and handle everything completely different. And I think that a lot of that goes back to what people grow up seeing. So what are some things that you've noticed between cultures when it comes to spending or planning and stuff like that?
I think it's important to frame the discussion about that in an acknowledgement or a recognition, though, that there are both cultural things, but then there are things that are less cultural than they are historical or socioeconomical. So, to give kind of some random examples, you have the example of something like the concept of the black tax, and the black tax is a observed sociological phenomenon in which the first successful child of a black family, and that's just where the term black tax comes from, will get out of poverty, right? Will be the first person to go to college or the first person to become a professional athlete or successful business person. And then immediately their personal wealth building or their personal financial well-being suffers, not be it for anything bad necessarily, but because essentially their family kind of, gathers around them and asks for support, like, oh, well, you've got this big hotshot job or this very successful business, you need to help with XYZ. And familial expectations can cause an effect where essentially, even though the person is individually very successful, they're a doctor, they're a lawyer, they're whatever they're doing, they have a hard time building wealth. And so, there's interesting cultural dynamics in a phenomenon like that where we look at something and say, okay, different cultures, both in within the United States and outside of the United States, have different cultural values and expectations. The US is often described as being highly individualistic. Other countries and other cultures are often described as being more communal, but there can be, smaller communities, whether it's based on religion, race, just country of origin, that sometimes have more cultural or culturally oriented or community oriented factors when we focus on working with individual clients could seem like unconstructive or negative behaviors, but that ultimately do reflect the values of people from different backgrounds.
When you talk about the US being more of an individualistic view, what do you mean by that?
Well, a kind of classic example of two countries on opposite ends of the distribution, the US being highly individualistic, and you could compare to a place like China, which is highly communal, right? The question is not what's good for me, the question is what is good for the group. And so there's this, a
Okay.
difference in culture where there's a focus on sacrifice and community contribution in a place like China versus the United States, where things are much more focused on what's good for me, what's going to benefit me the most, and so on.
So individualistic per se could be more of like personal achievement, freedom for yourself, and more of like an independence view in wealth.
It can also be a question of, what is the degree of familial relationship? So, for example,
Mhm.
in certain parts of the Middle East, you have a very non-national identity focused type of community where many of the focus is on your family and then on your kind of your clan, your larger family, and then on your community, and then on your region, and then on your country. Whereas in the US, a lot of people kind of jump straight to a I'm a member of the US sort of cultural lens of viewing things. And again, this is not to say that anything is better or worse, but financial planning, we don't do financial planning, for example, for a family of 12 with six different households and grandma, grandpa, first generation, second generation, third generation, right? We do financial
Mhm.
planning, and financial planning is built to serve the needs of an individual or serve the needs of a household, but not the needs of eight brothers and sisters spread across eight different households at the same time. And so, again, when we
Mhm.
talk about differences in perception of wealth planning, in different parts of the world, wealth planning might be look entirely different than how it looks here in the US based on our more individualistically focused culture. And that also then means for somebody who, let's say, lives in the US but comes from a more communal culture or comes from a more family oriented culture, that common financial planning practices may not align well to the beliefs that they hold.
I'm just kind of interested to know when have you had these types of experiences where it's a family who comes in and they have different culture views on certain things, and there's certain celebrations that have to be celebrated? Have you had some clients like these?
Well, certainly. I mean, things that need to be celebrated or things that even surprise me, as a financial planner. So when I sometimes still see people who are much more strict or much more vehement about individualistic versus family things. So, for example, and I'll give two examples here. On one end, I once had a client whose daughter got into UCLA. And my first instinct as a financial planner is like, well, that's a great school. It's also a very expensive school. Have you thought about relocating or trying to establish residency in California so that it'll be more affordable? And there zero hesitation, almost a rebuke, like absolutely not. Like we would in no way, shape, or form would we even think about delaying our daughter going to UCLA or otherwise doing anything that could jeopardize her acceptance to UCLA or getting through UCLA in 4 years by taking a gap year and moving out there to establish residency, even though it would have saved them over $100,000 over the course of tuition.
Yeah.
That thought did not even occur to them for a second, and they were almost revolted by the notion that they would do anything that was not solely in the best interest of their daughter getting the best education
Mhm.
as soon as possible. And on the other side, and I'll use you as an example here, right? When we sit down every week and we have the weekly team meeting, I would take the over on a bet, on an over under bet, that when we ask you, Anahi, what did you do this weekend? Your answer is going to be, I did something with my family. I think that's your answer
That's correct.
100% of the time. And that's culturally different, right? Like my family lives here, or at least part of my family lives here in town. And you could win the under on that bet every time for me by saying, I don't think Dan is going to tell me that he did something with his family this weekend, right? We live in the same town. We live in the same area. We work in the same
Yeah.
business. But you and I do, even though we're both Americans, have different cultures that influence our kind of view and perception of something like the necessity of doing a thing, right? Like I'm going to bet you don't miss a birthday. I'm going to bet you don't miss an anniversary. I'm going to bet you don't miss any special occasion in any person in your family's life for any reason. And for me,
That's
you got
correct.
to you got to twist my arm to make me show up to stuff.
Well, that's where I think it's interesting because, for example, my culture, my family, our traditions, like a good example I can give is quinceañeras. It's often celebrated by even families who don't have that money, but they still find the money to make that quinceañera happen. And I feel like that quinceañera is something that's really important to our tradition, and that regardless what the financial situation is, it's gonna happen. So that's where I came into like asking, where do these traditions come in, or do these conversations that often come up in like the initial consult? Is there something that just develops over time? How does that work?
It's an interesting question because I think there's sort of two steps to the question at hand here. The first one is just what's happening, right? Like when you say, for example, like a
Mhm.
quinceañera is very expensive, what you're articulating here is a cultural value that money is not going to be the deciding factor. A quinceañera or the special event will happen. It's gonna happen. We
Yeah,
will do it.
has to.
Whether we have the money for it or not is not relevant, right? The thing comes before the cost or before the financial considerations. Other cultures, right? Like for me or for my family, I was raised in a point of view of the world and a culture that says you don't buy things you can't afford or you don't do things you can't afford. Doesn't matter how important it is to you, doesn't matter how meaningful it is to you. You don't buy a car you can't afford, you don't take a trip you can't afford, you don't go on a vacation that you can't afford. And so, that's a default decision making framework that's culturally informed, right? Culture A says you do the thing and we figure the money out afterwards. Culture B says the money tells us what we are allowed to do or not. And so when we see that in planning, it's the same question. When we get to know a client and get to understand their values, an important thing we as financial planners have to do is not impose our values on clients. So, for example, you'll almost never hear me or anybody in the financial planning business say, you cannot do that, or you are not allowed to do that. Because even though we as
Yeah.
financial planners might look at the math and say, by the math, you can't do that, or that's not going to work, We are not here to tell people that they can or cannot do things. We're here to help facilitate their best financial lives. So when somebody says, I want to do something, unless we think it's actually harmful, I want to jump off a cliff, right? But as long as it's not actually harmful in that way, we look at them and say, okay, you're telling me this is important to you. My job is to help you figure out how to do that. Even if I personally don't think it's a good idea or valuable or worthy, that's not my job. My job is not to assess value to the things you want out of your life. My job is to help you live your best life.
So in celebrations, like big celebrations like theirs are a big spending, I guess. I'm unfortunately not that aware of other cultures, but do you see these conversations happening in the initial consult, like right away, or is it something that comes over time?
We see a little bit of it in the consult, and sometimes we see this in
Mm.
something as simple as this potential client's focus is on their own retirement, their own financial independence, their own financial steps,
Yeah,
and we have to really dig or pull at like, and what about your kids, or what about your family, or what about things? And in other cases, those are the first things come up. Well, yeah, I want to help my kids with school. I want to support my parents. I want to take care of my sibling who has special needs, and they themselves, their personal need comes last in the conversation. Those are hints about what this person prioritizes and what they value. I think it's a great old expression, which is show me what you spend your money on and I'll tell you what you value.
what are some habits do you think people pick up based on culture or differently that you've noticed over time that people just carry on for the rest of their lives?
Oh, I mean, everything to do with the psychological construct or framework of money scripts is heavily informed by cultural and experience. A penny saved is a penny earned to some people sounds like the default setting, and for other people they're like, that doesn't make any sense to me, that doesn't speak to me.
Yeah.
Some people come from a place of financial abundance, some people come from a place of financial scarcity, and that may have nothing to do with their financial feasibility. There are people who have way more money than they'll ever need who still feel like money is a scarcity, and they have to be very careful and cautious with it. And there are people who have nothing who feel like they live in financial abundance. But what we see and emulate and experience early on in our life becomes a big deterministic factor of how we treat money for the rest of our lives. The primary theory on this is what's called the theory of family financial socialization, in which we learn money lessons both deliberately, right? My mom, my dad, somebody in my family sits me down and explains something to me about money. And then there are money lessons we pick up passively from our family, right? The behaviors we observe in our parents and our siblings, in the adults in our lives as children. And then there's also what we pick up from our community, right? It's meaningful to your view and your experience of money to be, wherever you land on the spectrum, one of the poor kids or one of the rich kids. Were you the poor kid in school? Were you the rich kid in school? Were you somewhere in the middle? How did you learn that? Did you learn that because you showed up in a nice new car every day at the school drop off and you started to notice your friends' parents drove older beater vans? Or were you the one walking to school even when you were 16,
Mhm.
17, 18, and you didn't get a car, but all your friends' parents were buying them cars? So we learn a lot as we grow up, and a lot of that is going to be culturally grounded.
I think that's the like when people ask me why I'm choosing this route as my career is because I really enjoy learning about other cultures and learning about how other people grow up and how it affects their mindsets and values. And that's literally it because I love learning more about people's backgrounds and what's making them make those choices over time. And I just think that that's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the unique privileges of being a financial planner is you get a first row seat to how people deal with money. And I've been doing this for over a decade, and people still surprise me all the time.
I bet there's always something new every day.
Pretty much.
So then, yep, I wanted to talk about more why clients don't take action. I think it's really interesting to see even when people understand money or they already have some knowledge or even already have a plan, it doesn't always mean that they take action right away. So for many, it's rarely just about numbers. It's often fear, feeling overwhelmed, or just simply putting it off. So what do you think actually stops people from making those changes in their finances?
I think it's important to recognize that what all the research shows us is that people make decisions emotionally first, and then they often back into facts or data points that support the decisions they make. So it's not being presented with numbers and going like, "Oh, the numbers make sense. I'll do what the numbers tell me." It's Do I feel good about this? Do I feel comfortable with this? Do I feel confident about this? And then if I do, is there evidence I can rely on as the reason for me doing this that supports it? And so we'll see people do things that there's no evidence for, but they ultimately still do it because it feels better to them emotionally. And there's other behaviors that are highly productive that people also happen to feel good about. And those don't always line up perfectly. The first thing you learn as a financial planner, in a real sense, that you don't learn in a textbook is the numbers are never as compelling as you want them to be. Nobody will ever take your advice solely because you presented the biggest number to them or the most beneficial outcome to them.
I can agree with some of the decisions first making an initial impact with just emotional sense, with just thinking about how that's gonna make them feel in the long run. And I mean, something I've heard you and Daniel talk about all the time is that more money isn't always the best option. It just really depends on a case by case basis on what people are wanting to do in their lifetime or what they're wanting to do after their lifetime. Um, so I do think it's really interesting because even looking at big numbers, obviously you're going to look at the big number and it's going to be such a big impact and you're going to be in awe by that big number. But I feel like a lot of things come before all of that.
Here's a really good example of this. If people were compelled by big numbers solely, nobody would ever have children. Right? One of the most
That's
devastating things we can
true.
do for financial plans is put children into the plans, right? Raising a kid typically ends up
Mhm.
costing something like 250 to $300,000 from 0 to
Oh,
18.
okay.
And then if you slap college on it, it ends up costing another 100, 200,000, $300,000, and the lifetime wealth impact ends up being 1 to $2 million easily. And so again, if the big number was compelling, our entire species would be dying out. We have clients who come in when we first work with them who say, like, we don't plan on having children. 2 or 3 years later, hey, we're thinking about it. 6 months later, hey, we wanted to let you know before we told anybody else, just so you could do it for planning. But we wanted to let you know we're expecting. Oh, congratulations. And then 2 years
Yeah.
later, hey, we're thinking about having another, right? And so their plan is getting numerically worse every step of this
Mhm.
process, but they've never been
Yeah.
they've never been happier. And I don't say that in the spirit of like everybody should have kids and that's going to make you happy. People are not letting the numbers decide these big life decisions for them. They're going ahead and making these big life decisions, and we're excited to support them in those decisions, whichever way they may go.
I've seen the plans where you as soon as you add one kid into the plan, it goes straight down. It goes straight down. But it also goes just it's all just based on people's happiness and what they want to live throughout their lives. And obviously money and having wealth and all of that is really important, but I feel like the most important part of life is just living it. So I can understand where that part can come in, but what about like fear? What about when people are scared to jump into something that they don't know a lot about and they are just putting all their trust on financial advisors?
Well, so that's an interesting question because I can say with plenty of experience as a financial planner, plenty of people articulate a fear or a concern and say, like, I don't understand it, so I don't want to do it. And then we'll educate them on it. We'll teach them and they'll be able to explain it back to us. And then they still won't take the action. And what that suggests is that a lack of understanding might have been part of the reason for inaction, but it's not the entire reason for inaction. And so again, this comes back to we make decisions emotionally. If you say, Dan, I understand that this decision you're presenting me with is going to make me $1 million. Okay. But I really want to, it seems like a big deal. I really want to understand it before I do it. Okay. Let's get educated about it. Fast forward, now we're educated. Great. Now that you understand this, or now that it's better, better understood, are we ready to make this decision? No, no, I'm not ready,
Yeah.
or no, I'm just not sure yet. And so education can be the roadblock. There's plenty of things people won't do until they understand it. But also at the end of the day, we're making decisions emotionally, not by the numbers, and not solely by just do we understand it or not.
Is there like a not like a limit, but something like a limit where you have tried helping somebody with a recommendation and they're just not taking it? Are there like context clues that you take where, okay, I've explained this many times. Have you ever what are the context clues there?
I mean, context clues there are essentially being problem oriented instead of solution oriented, right? Is the conversation constantly framed around why we can't do this, why we can't take this action, why this won't work? Or is it framed around how do we make this work? You know, we worked with a client over the last year, but we sort of knew early on in the relationship that they were probably not going to continue past the first year because they engaged us. We built a plan, we presented the plan, they said, "Yep, that looks like I want to do terrific." And then we said, "Here, you know, here are all the action items and steps you'll need to follow to implement that plan." And they said, "Yeah, I'm not sure about all of those, right? Like, I'm not sold on any of these things that you say align to the plan that I said I want." So he said, "Okay." And we had this long back and forth. Yeah, we're emailing, we're having meetings, we're having conversations, and we're explaining everything from insurance to investment stuff to everything. And eventually, every decision came down to, okay, I hear you. I understand it now. That makes sense to me, but I'm going to do what I want to do anyway. Right. And so, you know, throughout the course of this entire first year engagement, I'm not sure they took any advice. We educated about it a lot, but they ultimately were not looking to delegate and they were ultimately not looking to actually take our advice. They were looking for somebody to
Mhm,
validate the decisions they wanted to make. And we're fiduciaries to our clients, but we have a responsibility to tell people the truth, right? We have a duty of candor. And so part of that sometimes means presenting a client with, hey, you know, you want to do it in this particular way. And if you do it that way, that's okay. But that is not going to arrive at the outcome you say you want. If you want to arrive at the outcome you say you want, you have to take this action to course correct or improve conditions or make it possible. And then it's on the client to agree or disagree. We don't make any judgment around that. If somebody says, I don't want to be more aggressive with my investments, we say that's fine, but then we need to save more, work longer, or spend less. Well, I don't want to save
yeah.
more, and I
I
don't want to
feel
work longer, and I don't want to spend less. Well, then you're
yeah,
not going to get to do what you want to do.
mhm, yeah. I feel like this kinda goes hand in hand with my next question, so why do small financial decisions sometimes feel harder than bigger ones? Like, for example, somebody could find it very inclined to buy a house, which is huge, but find it very difficult to open, like, a small account somewhere. So what do you think are the factors there?
I find myself challenged to agree with the preposition of the question. This idea that it's harder to make bigger decisions. I don't know that it's harder to make bigger or smaller decisions or that there's a proportionality. Some people make big decisions really easily and do have a hard time with small decisions, but I see just as many people have a hard time taking significant action more than they do with small action. I think it's very individualized. I don't know that I see evidence for that in practice. It doesn't mean it's untrue, but I see plenty of people delay small decisions, and I see plenty of people delay big decisions, and I'm yet to see a commonality at like a certain dollar amount or a certain time frame or a certain
Mhm,
percentage of income or something like that. I've had people hand over their life savings in a remarkably short amount of time, and you'd think that would be a
mhm,
huge decision for them, but they'd already emotionally made the decision to do it. And in other cases, I've seen people delay for months or years simple actions like getting their estate plan done or switching over their
yeah,
home and auto insurance because they're paying out the nose for bad coverage. And yet, sometimes, for
yeah.
whatever reason, people are just hesitant to take the leap or do things.
So it's very individualized, I guess, per se. Some of the smaller decisions go with just smaller decisions and harder go with harder. Yeah, I can see that being true. I just personally thought, for example, somebody can make such a big purchase or like wanting to buy something very expensive and like for example, like the estate planning, something that's very important. But then again, I can see the very different perceptions of each where both of them can be very different and individualized and not they're like not a direct correlation between both of them.
I think to some extent, there's a sort of an observation in statistics where when you do like big sociological studies or econometric studies of like families, we surveyed 5,000 families, or we have got a huge data set that tells us about saving behavior or something like that. The challenge with the results of all those studies is not that they don't tell us something; they do tell us quite a bit, but that you
Mhm.
can't take data from any large data set and use it to make assumptions about individual behavior. You can only use it to understand the aggregate behavior of that group.
And like we've mentioned, financial advisors are the people who you go to and talk about your entire life. Everything and anything can come up during consultations. I feel like oftentimes advisors are the people you go to that even your closest family doesn't know about you. But there might also come a time where it just doesn't make sense to continue working with them. And some people are quick to make that jump, and some people just stay longer because it feels simply awkward to walk away. How do you know if a financial advisor is no longer the right fit?
I have a really simple framework here, and we can get into more specific examples to your question, but there's a really good theoretical framework for this, which is financial planner client interaction theory. And it boils down to an incredibly simple calculation. The client, the consumer, the person paying for the service, feel that you receive value equal to or greater than the value that you are paying, right? So if I'm paying $10,000 a year, do I feel like I get more than $10,000 of value back from this relationship? And it doesn't have to be in money terms. It can be peace of mind, time saved. It can be in all sorts of kind of softer things than just, do I get a return on this investment equal to or greater than my cost? And the good news is, usually the answer is yes to both. But if you sit there and you find yourself going, I know my financial advisor is making me 12% a year, they're doing a great job. And so I know they're objectively paying for themselves, but I don't feel that value. I don't feel like that's greater than what I'm paying in terms of money or in terms of time or in terms of energy. Then that alone is sort of the biggest indicator, is just, do I feel that the value is not greater than the cost? Then you get into the specifics. What makes that feeling present for you?
And like you said, it can be both monetary and just feeling. I feel like a lot has to come with trust and having trust within your advisor. I feel like if after a certain time you feel like they are not doing things on your best interest, or if you just don't have that trust in itself where you can talk to them about anything that's going on in your financial life, if you feel like judgment or stuff like that, I feel like that's also a big move. But how often is it that people actually make that jump from one advisor to another advisor?
It's interesting. Industry retention rates are typically higher than 90% year over year. Like, most people stick with their advisor year over year. The average
Yeah.
duration of a advisor client relationship is anywhere from 20 to 30 years. So, I mean, people tend to stick with their advisors for a long time, but every year we do bring on, a handful of clients who were working with somebody else. Sometimes a very impersonal, distant relationship. They were working with a guy in a call center for Vanguard, or they had their money invested with a Fidelity advisor who just did the investments but didn't talk to them about planning. Sometimes it's very easy to just sort of see the difference. Like, hey, I'm kind of working with a guy on the phone I've never really met and don't really know, or I'm working with somebody who only does one service, and now I'm looking for a, but it's not also lost on us that a healthy number of people do come to us who are working with a local Ed Jones advisor or Northwestern place, or even sometimes they're coming from another fee only RIA. And usually in those cases, then it's often less about a suite of services or products, and it's more often
Mhm.
related to kind of just like a lack of trust. I thought I was going to trust
Yeah,
this person, and I did trust this person, but I don't feel any better about them than I did when I started, or I feel worse about them now than when I started. And if we don't have a good constant of trust or growing trust, that is a pretty big red flag.
as far as clients go, what do you think has helped you the most keep clients?
I don't really know why clients like us.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's an expression, right? Familiarity breeds contempt, and in that regard, we all
Mhm.
know ourselves better than anybody else knows us. And I am always surprised at how much our clients seem to like us and enjoy us, and enjoy the relationship we have. And that's not to say everybody likes me. I'm definitely not everybody's cup of tea, but our clients describe us often in very familiar terms. I mentioned earlier, clients will tell us, "Hey, we're expecting our kids. We haven't told anybody else, but we thought we would tell you first." Like, that's happened
Yeah,
more times than I can count at this point. And it's a blessing and a privilege. But I think, to some extent, to boil down the answer to your question, I think two things happen. I think we provide a exceptional service for clients that is hard to get elsewhere. And because we do that, and we do that in such a personal way, in such an individualized and bespoke way, our clients then also come to trust us very deeply on a personal level. And so it's a combination of objective value in terms of taxes not paid and investments returned and risks managed and so on. and also just this deep abiding sense of, you know what, I think Dan and the team at my wealth planners are really taking care of me, and they really, want what's best for me. And I think that just builds really
Mhm.
strong relationships with most of our clients.
Yeah, I definitely do notice more of the relationship when it comes to clients, where it's more about trust and getting to know about each other and getting to know what's happening in their lives. And it's I personally think it's rare when we actually talk about their investments, or like their how much their investments have grown compared to how much we talk about their life and their family and what's going on in their lives. That's something that I do really notice, and I can say that I personally see people being grateful for the fact that we are so personable with them, and that we talk to them about more about their lives and what's keeping them comfortable.
Yeah.
So maybe when you get to that. Oh, word.
So not to interrupt you there. I mean, you're observing a thing that's just sort of remarkable, right? We'll spend 90% of a client meeting talking about anything but taxes or about investments or about
Yes.
insurance.
Yes,
We're
exactly.
talking about their lives, what's going on in their lives, what they
Mhm.
want, what their objectives are, what's making them happy or what's frustrating them, and we'll have this broad conversation. And then in the last 5 or 10 minutes, we'll come around to, oh, and by the way, yeah, we need to get your tax return, so we can review that,
Yeah,
or yes, we'll put you in touch with that insurance broker to get your PNC policies updated. And that's very
yeah,
normal, and it surprises the heck out of me because I don't think I ever expected that would be the tone or the ratio of the conversations that we'd have with clients, but that's almost always the
yeah.
case.
Is it just something that we've cultivated over time? Is it normal?
I think it is. So I have two answers here. I think amongst what I
Mhm,
would call real financial planners, absolutely, that's probably the norm. And then I think
mhm.
amongst the larger industry, so I tend to divide the term of financial planners as a profession, and then there's sort of the financial advice industry, and
Yeah,
planners.
yeah,
Planners are a subsection of that industry. The planners definitely are having these types of conversations, these good, high quality discussions. And by the way, the planning stuff has all been taken care of. And I think in the larger industry, they don't have any interest in having personal conversations with clients. They're just in the business of either, learning more about people so that they can ask them to give them more money, or they're in the business of going out and exploring new opportunities to sell them new products. Literally this morning, a gentleman here in Longmont came in to just have a conversation with me as like a business professional peer, so not a client, anything like that. And he said, "Oh, I left my prior employer a year or two ago, and I had a 401k there, and I took it to Fidelity, and I'm talking to a Fidelity guy, and he wanted me to bring him everything." Right, it's like my CDs, my checking, my say. He just wanted me to bring everything to Fidelity, and that was the first conversation we had. We don't start with "give me all your money." We start with, "I want to
no,
understand you. I want to understand your goals. I want to understand your situation. I want to build a plan and really understand with you and collaborate with you to build this strong model of where we are and where we're going." And then once we've done that over the course of several meetings, weeks, months, then we can have a conversation about how we effectuate that plan. And that
yeah.
maybe involves moving money around or something like that. So it's just a very different way of approaching the relationship.
So when it comes to towards the end of the relationship with the financial advisor that you're thinking about leaving, what are some questions that you should either ask yourself or the actual advisor themselves? Like, would should you give them an opportunity to like try them, give them the opportunity to prove why you should stay with them, or is that often heard about, or is it just like a we're done?
In practice, I think it's more often the "we're done," and this is a tough question to answer because I know it from my own experience, right? If a client said, "Dan, I don't think you're doing a very good job for me," or "I don't think it's a fit for me," or
Mhm.
something, I would want to, defend myself, or I would want to speak up for myself. But I also know that in practice, when
Yeah.
a client says, "Hey, I'm ready to move on," our response is always essentially, "Hey, it's been a pleasure to serve you. What can we do to make this
Mhm.
transition easier for you?" And so, to some extent, I think that's probably the better framing. I think if you are on the fence, I think it helps to meet with your advisor and have a expectations conversation. And this isn't like a performance improvement plan type of conversation, but I think it's just saying, "Hey, when I started working with you or I engaged you, here's what I was expecting, here's what I experienced, here's what I'm experiencing today, and I don't feel like that aligns to what I was expecting or what I would want now." Is that sometimes, because sometimes it is a me issue, right? Like I have unrealistic expectations, or I want something that you can't deliver. And I think an ethical advisor will say, "You're right. I can't do that for you. So here's what I think we can do to either fix that, or here's where I think you can get what you're looking for." And in turn, right, sometimes, the advisor is going to say, "Oh, we apologies, we have dropped the ball on something, and I'm going to make an effort to fix that." But I think when you get to the point where you're thinking about this professional who should be one of the most trusted, closest relationships you have, if you don't have sort of like this unquestionable, like, "Yep, I think they're valuable. I think they're great. I think they're worth it," and you find yourself questioning, I think it's better to have that conversation about expectations and whether your expectations are reasonable and whether they can meet your expectations sooner than later. And if the answer is
Mhm.
no, it's okay to explore it. But I'll tell you, there's a lot of low hanging fruit here. A lot of people come to us because they're like, "You know what? I haven't talked to my advisor in 5 years," or when I call or email, I never get a response, or
Yeah.
they tell me my investments are doing great, but it doesn't seem like they're doing great, and I don't understand how that's possible. It's always
Mhm.
very simplistic, single issue things. Like clients coming from other advisors don't tend to come to us with a laundry list of problems. There always seems to
Yeah.
be this single point of disquiet, right? I just
Mhm.
wish they'd answer my emails. I just wish that I understood what was happening with my money. I just wish that I could see them more than once a year, right? And those sorts of questions and those sorts of issues are very common. And the trick here sometimes is maybe what you want is a realistic expectation. Maybe it's something the advisor can offer. Maybe it's something they can't offer, and if they can, great,
Mhm.
set your expectation with them, get reasserted there, and then hopefully your relationship thrives. And if they can't offer it or they say they will and then they still don't, then it's okay to say this isn't right for me.
Yep. I think it also really depends on the advisor being sure that they're able to give 100% to their clients. And yeah, of course, it sometimes comes down to the point where maybe it's just they're not responding to my email soon enough, but I feel like it also goes both ways. The advisor should know that they should be able to give 100% to each and one of their clients, and the client themselves should also know that they are very busy and that they have a lot of stuff going on in the back end. So I think this was a very interesting conversation just to know, like, in that awkward stage, like when you're thinking about, I'm going to leave my advisor, it's a deep relationship that you create with someone. You walk in the first meeting and you start talking about your whole life, your whole family, your whole finances, what you've done so far. I feel like it'd just be something that you'd really have to put your thought into.
Well, and I mean, it's a deep relationship. It's the same that I won't say it's quite as deep as the relationship you have with your spouse, but it's the type of relationship you'd have with your therapist or your family
Yeah.
doctor or your lawyer if you've ever kind of had some serious financial, or not financial, but legal issues. I mean, you build a deep and personal relationship, and there's a little bit of it feels like breaking up, and that's uncomfortable and emotionally
Yeah.
tumultuous. I will say though, sometimes people come in and they're like, my old advisor is so fired, like there's no hesitation. So,
Uh,
some of us in this field are unfortunately blowing it pretty badly. I'll ask you, what have you learned in the last week or two since you've been on the podcast that you'd like to share with the audience?
This week, I learned a little bit more of community property states. I thought it was very interesting that only 9 states follow that system. In community property states, most income and assets earned during marriage are treated as jointly owned and split 50-50. So, this doesn't include property covered by prenuptial agreements or inheritance or anything that happened before the marriage. But in most states, like Colorado, use common law instead, where income and assets usually belong to the person who earned or owns them unless they've combined them during the marriage. So I thought it was interesting that two couples can have completely different outcomes if they lived in Colorado as opposed to like California, for example. So the outcome would be completely different if it was done kind of the same.
And I tend to summarize even Colorado because the way you describe it makes it sort of sound like we're like stacking up money on opposite sides of the table between in a couple. Even in a
Mhm.
place like Colorado with common law approach, it's still kind of it's our money, it's marital property, right? If I make money, it's
Mhm.
also my spouse's and vice versa. But I think the better way to kind of put it is like there's in common law states there's our money, and in community property states there's our money, period, bold text
Yeah.
underlined, like it's ours, really, really, it's ours.
Hours.
And
Emphasis.
yeah, and then that does definitely create some interesting outcomes in family law cases and estate cases and so on.
Yeah.
The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed on the podcast is appropriate for every individual in every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of these subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.